really wish I had the luxury of absolute, unquestioning faith. I do not, and I'm still searching. I wrote this novel as part of my own spiritual quest. I never imagined a novel could become so controversial. I'm aware there are those out there, more aware now that I've read the press in New Hampshire, who disagree with me, who say awful things about me, who make little pictures. And I know that a lot of these people have published long lists of my shortcomings, my errors, my inadequacies. Sadly, I think many of these critics seem to have missed the entire point of the novel. That being this: one simple, undebatable truth. Prior to 2,000 years ago, we lived in a world of gods and goddesses. Today we live in a world solely of gods. Women in most cultures have been stripped of their spiritual power, and our male-dominated philosophies of absolutism have a long history of violence and bloodshed which continues to this day. What I've finally come to accept is that science and religion are partners. They're simply two different languages attempting to tell the same story. Both are manifestations of man's quest to understand the divine. While science dwells on the answers, religion savors the questions.
When I started researching Da Vinci Code, I really was skeptical, and I expected on some level to disprove all of this history that's unearthed in the books. And after 3 trips to Paris and a lot of interviews, I became a believer.
The Da Vinci Code has brought together a lot of ideas from alternative history books.
I think the first thing to remember about Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code is that it's a novel. You know, it's a page-turner. It allegedly, or possibly, has you on the edge of your seat. You want to know what happens to these people and whether they find the thing and how amazing it all is. But of course, we're terribly grateful to it, really, because our book, The Temple Revelation, which came out 7 years ago now, is mentioned as an authority in the book by name, by title. Which is great, because our book has taken off on the back of it. And our book is not a novel. Our book represents a lot of very hard research into some very profound subjects. Unfortunately, Dan Brown doesn't seem to understand some of the research, our research, which he repeats in the book. But in a way that's okay, because he's handed it over to us, people who, you know, see the title of our book in his book and buy us or look us up, so that's great.
What Dan Brown's done very cleverly is bring together some of those ideas and put them into a contemporary thriller.
So the one thing we can be sure about is that the story that we're familiar with, when we're brought up as Christians, is wrong. So even if you debunk all the other alternatives, what's left is still not, you can't say it's true, you can say it's definitely wrong. That's the reason why there are all these alternative ideas around, because we all start from the position that what we've been taught all this time is demonstrably wrong. Let's try and find out what the truth is.
Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code is a publishing phenomenon. Over 10 million copies sold and rising steadily. This book can truly be called a worldwide bestseller. Never has a book raised so many contentious issues though. On the one hand championed by so many people, and on the other hand vilified by others who think this is blasphemy, heresy. So what is the truth behind all of this? What is the mystery of the Da Vinci Code? Is there really a Da Vinci Code? My name is Simon Cox, and I'm author of Cracking the Da Vinci Code. I want to take you on a journey deep inside the novel. I want to unravel some of the mysteries and show you some of the historical facts behind the fiction.
In the critical early chapters of the Da Vinci Code, the Louvre Museum in Paris features prominently as the scene of much of the action. It has been the murder site of Jacques Chaumière, the meeting place for Robert Langdon and Sophie Nouveau, and due to the suspicions of the police chief, Boucher-Fachet, the starting point of the pursuit that eventually leads to London and then Scotland.
We certainly believe that there's real evidence beyond fiction for such, well, several cover-ups. One concerned with John the Baptist and his real status, and one concerned with ditto, with Mary Magdalene and her real status, which actually affects the way the Church has treated all women for 2,000 years.
Yeah, well, the nature usually of orthodoxy is that its capacity for change is limited, because it has painted itself into a corner. It has locked itself up in a box from which it is very, very difficult to come out. So you can see, for instance, in some relatively minor ways, the present Pope, for instance, tries to loosen up certain things, and he has avowed the fact that Mary Magdalene is very important. He has called Mary Magdalene the Apostle of the Apostles. He has disavowed the position of earlier popes that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute and just a repentant sinner, and that was her principal function and things of that sort. So, but the limitations that orthodoxy has come to impose upon itself only allow it to change so much, and after that it can't really do it without just cutting its own throat.
In the Da Vinci Code, the body of Jacques Sonnier, curator of the Louvre, is found in the Grand Gallery. It is arranged in the image of Leonardo's famous Vitruvian Man. Most modern visitors to the Grand Gallery hasten past the myriad collection of great masterpieces lining the walls of this extraordinary space in order to get to the wondrous Mona Lisa at the far end. It is within the Grand Gallery that Sophie and Robert are led to information on the back of Leonardo's renowned Madonna on the Rocks, where they find a key to the safety deposit box at the Zurich Depository Bank. The Madonna of the Rocks is the name given to two versions of a religious painting by Leonardo da Vinci that portray the Virgin Mary sitting with the infants Jesus and John the Baptist. They are accompanied by an angel believed to be the Archangel Uriel, and the composition is triangular in shape with the Virgin Mary at its apex. The earlier and more perplexing of the two versions was commissioned for the Church of San Francesco Grande in Milan. This painting features a rocky grotto with a seated Virgin Mary in its center. Beside her sit two infants, Jesus and John the Baptist, while Uriel kneels to her left slightly behind one of the babies. The child, believed to be Jesus, sits cross-legged and slightly away from Mary. His right hand is raised in a gesture of blessing aimed at the other child, and above this Mary's downcast hand hovers over his head. Besides this child, Uriel points at the other child sitting to Mary's right. This infant, thought to be John the Baptist, has his hands clasped together as if in prayer, while Mary's right hand embraces his shoulder. Looking at the painting objectively, it would be more probable that the child praying is Jesus and not John the Baptist, as he sits closer to the Virgin Mary, as in fact being cuddled and protected by her. It would then make sense for the other child who sits farther away from the Virgin to be John the Baptist, who is under the protection of the Archangel with whom he is associated. This is the theory advanced by Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett in their book, The Templar Revelation.
It's very amusing to us that if you go into the grand art galleries and where they have Leonardo's on display, and people stand in front of them or sit in front of them, reverentially, as if, if there were candles there, they would light them to them. They see them as holy works. And perhaps they were in a way, but certainly not holy Christian works in the usual sense of the word. There's a lot of savage, anti-Christian work there, a lot of savage satire, including in the Madonna of the Rocks, which is a version in Paris and in London, some extremely vulgar but extremely savage satire on the alleged virginity of Mary the Mother.
In the second version of the painting, which now hangs in the National Gallery in London, the figures are slightly larger and have been given halos. The Archangel Uriel no longer points towards the infant to the Virgin Mary's right, who now holds the cross of John the Baptist. This cross appears to have been added at a later date by another painter, and may not reflect Leonardo da Vinci's intention. This revision in the second painting may have been made to remove the ambiguity about the two infants. The earlier version seems to reflect the Templar tradition of venerating John the Baptist over Jesus. It is not surprising that the confraternity who commissioned this painting rejected the earlier version, as it did not adequately depict their ideal of the Holy Family sheltering in a cave in Egypt during their flight from Herod. In Dan Brown's novel, Sophie Neveu is led to the first version of the Madonna on the Rocks hanging in the Louvre by an anagram left by her grandfather, and it is behind this painting that she finds the key to the safety deposit box.
Leonardo was no Christian. In fact, he hated, judging by his paintings alone, if you look at them objectively, he actually hated the Holy Family. For example, whenever he painted himself in his paintings, and he was very keen to do this, he involved himself in his works, he painted himself with his back to the Holy Family. For example, in the Adoration of the Magi, there's a young man in the bottom right-hand corner, turned away like this, quite vehemently. And historians generally accept that that is Leonardo himself. And in the Last Supper, Saint Jude, who by the way is patron saint of lost causes, so that's quite amusing, is at the end of the table with his back to the central figure of Jesus. In the Adoration of the Magi, there's something very, very interesting going on, which is a key to all the secret, the real Da Vinci Code.
Everyone loves a conspiracy, which is why Dan Brown included a reference to Leonardo's unfinished masterpiece, Adoration of the Magi. Within the novel, Brown recounts the story of how a Florence-based art diagnostician named Maurizio Serracini had discovered that under layers of grime and overpainting was a very different composition of Leonardo. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence was so embarrassed by his findings that they banished the painting to a nearby warehouse. Serracini has become famous for his use of medical technology to reveal the secrets of the old masters. He has examined works by Botticelli, Caravaggio, and Raphael, as well as many other master painters. His examination of the Adoration of the Magi stirred a raging debate in the art world. Serracini came to some remarkable and controversial conclusions. In his words, none of the paint that we see on the Adoration today was put there by Leonardo. Serracini believes that a much later hand clumsily applied the layers of brown and orange paint that now adorn the canvas. He points out that many of the painted features are totally devoid of the finesse and quality of Leonardo's hand, especially in the depiction of human anatomy. supporting this theory in his discovery of a wholly different scene beneath the existing work. Seracini suggests that Leonardo wanted to portray a world that was being reconstructed from ruins, a reflection of the master's feelings at the beginning of the Renaissance.
Which is a whole lot more shocking than anything Dan Brown put in his book. In the Adoration of the Magi, you'll notice, if you really look, that at the front, the front part, the foreground of the painting, the people adoring the Madonna and Child are all hideous. They look like the Walking Dead. They've got sunken eyes and sunken cheeks, and they're clawing at the Holy Family, which is very strange, especially when you realise that there's another bunch of worshippers, a sort of second group, beyond and above those, beyond the Virgin Mary. And they appear to be worshipping the roots of a tree, or the tree itself. And these people, these worshippers, are young and healthy and good-looking. And one of them standing next to the tree is doing that, which we came to understand refers in Leonardo's works to John the Baptist. And it's interesting because this tree is a carob tree, which in church tradition is a symbol of John the Baptist. So what you have is Leonardo himself turned away from the Virgin and Child, the worshippers of the Virgin and Child looking like nothing on earth, looking like something from hell, and the worshippers of symbols connected with John the Baptist being young and healthy. And so one is led to think that Leonardo had something about John the Baptist, which he certainly did, judging from his other paintings.
Leonardo da Vinci is, like Michelangelo, Leonardo is a great Renaissance figure, and the people at that time were all subject already to the revival of alternative spirituality, largely by way of Hermetic and Kabbalistic sources, and therefore they often, probably at least secretly, held various positions and beliefs which were not consistent with regular church orthodoxy. Whether a Johannine tradition, a John the Baptist tradition, actually in some tangible forms through Templar sources or things like that, may have survived to that point and reached Leonardo da Vinci is possible, but it's again highly speculative.
Another interesting actually pair of paintings, because of the continuity of ideas between them, or actually first not a painting, it's the famous cartoon that's in London's National Gallery. But that painting, although it wasn't completed, it turned into another one, which was completed, which is the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. And in that, that painting, it's basically the same little scene, except infant John isn't there anymore, he's been replaced by a lamb. Now, although Jesus is often called the Lamb of God, because it was John the Baptist who, according to the Gospels, pointed him out, said, "Behold the Lamb of God," the symbol was often also used of John, and clearly is in this painting. Incidentally, it was also Lamb of God to represent John was also something that the Knights Templar used. And so clearly in this painting, the lamb is supposed to represent John the Baptist. And again, if you look at the way child Jesus is playing with the lamb, the lamb isn't happy. He's being roughed up. And we used to have this joke that it looks almost as if Jesus is trying to pull the lamb's head off. But then if you actually look at it, it's got hold of it by the ears and does appear to be. It's got a leg wrapped around the lamb's neck, kind of, again, separating its head. So you keep getting this severed head symbolism connected with John the Baptist for obvious reasons, as he died by beheading. But this kind of interaction between Jesus and John actually suggesting a struggle, a rivalry.
The Last Supper is widely considered to be Leonardo's greatest masterpiece. Having recently undergone extensive restoration, this fresco, his refectory of the Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, poses many intriguing questions. The central figure shows Christ at the Last Supper surrounded by his apostles. This scene is the origin of the Eucharist, which forms the central observance of the Christian Church's Holy Communion. Note, however, that in Leonardo's painting there is no central cup or chalice which would be required for this ritual. Is Leonardo hinting at a different meaning for the Holy Grail? According to Picknett and Prince in their book Templar Revelation, the figure to the right of Christ, our left as we view the painting, is a woman. In his book, Dan Brown has Lee Teeving explained that this figure is none other than Mary Magdalene. Within the Last Supper, Leonardo has depicted the moment when the apostles hear from Jesus that one of them will betray him. The painter captured in the followers' faces the different reactions to this terrible news. Another feature of the painting that Picknett and Prince highlight is the so-called disembodied hand, which can be seen holding a knife, but in the restored version of the fresco seems to belong to Apostle Peter. The possible female figure is seen in close connection to Peter, who seems to extend a menacing hand across her throat. This possibly echoes Peter's antagonism towards Magdalene, as described in some of the Gnostic Gospels. As mentioned in the Templar Revelation and the Da Vinci Code, the two central characters are wearing identical but opposite-colored clothing of blue and red, and their bodies leaning away from each other form the letter M. On the other side of Christ is the figure of Thomas, who is making what has come to be known as the John gesture with his upraised finger. Normally associated with John the Baptist, it is unknown why Leonardo assigned it to Thomas. Scholars and academics generally agree that the bearded figure with his back to Jesus is a self-portrait of Leonardo as the disciple Thaddeus. It seems that within this very traditional and familiar scene, Leonardo has managed to embed symbolism, mystery, and intrigue in equal measures.
Many of the characters painted by Leonardo da Vinci seem to have an ambiguous sexuality. If we were to look at the character to the right of Christ in the Last Supper, to the left as we look, the so-called figure of Mary Magdalene may well be seen, as Prince and Picknett contest. However, this character could just as easily be a male. If we were to look at the character of St. John the Baptist in Leonardo's last painting, or the Mona Lisa, Leonardo's most famous painting, we would see here that there is also ambiguous sexuality. If one were to take the hair away from these characters, for instance, sexual stereotypes play no part. These characters are distinctly hermaphroditic, and it's a possibility that Leonardo is trying to put across this very theme within his paintings, the idea of the conjoining of the male and female. This very Gnostic thought is something that many scholars believe Leonardo was actually trying to get across.
It's quite interesting that one of the most famous paintings in the world is Leonardo's Last Supper, which is a wall painting. I mean, there's copies of it everywhere, you know, from sort of bath mats and things like this. But it's very, very little known, really, even by the so-called experts who are far too close to it and far too far away from Leonardo's esoteric roots to really see what it's about and why he painted it. Well, of course, the first reason he painted it was that he was commissioned to do so. So he was doing it basically for a livelihood, so that must be remembered. But secondly, Leonardo, whenever he could, imbued his works with heretical messages for those with eyes to see, basically. He sailed very close to the wind, considering what happened to people who did things like this and didn't get away with it. But in his Last Supper, famously now because of Dan Brown, says she through gritted teeth, is a woman sitting next to Jesus, and not the young Saint John. Well, it's kind of a blend, because this character does have a little beard, but that's as far as it goes. It's a token beard, and for all we know, Magdalene did have a beard. But she is leaning away. He is leaning away from Jesus like this, and the shape that they make is a sort of giant M shape, which we thought, is this a clue to who this person really is? And another clue, perhaps, is the fact that Jesus is wearing a sort of red dress, a robe, and a blue half cloak thrown over one shoulder. And this character, we'll call her Mary Magdalene, because everybody knows that's the conclusion that we come to, and is wearing the opposite. She's wearing a blue dress and a red cloak. And they seem to be almost literally joined at the hip, although she's leaning away. You wouldn't understand why if you just look at the New Testament, but in lots of forbidden and heretical texts, it's spelt out that they were lovers. Not married, which is, you know, what Dan Brown and others claim, but lovers. It's heavy emphasis on lovers. Perhaps in a ritual, sacred sex sense, almost certainly. But were they also, in an ordinary sense, lovers? Who knows? But in the Last Supper, there's lots of other things which just sort of show that people don't really look at it, don't really see. For example, there's a hand with a dagger in it. It's been thrust at one of the disciples' stomachs. And I've heard, actually, an alleged world expert on Leonardo saying it's the hand of a certain disciple. But I mean, if it is, we have tried physically to get into that sort of position to do this, and you'd have to be a contortionist. And the big question is, why would you have to be a contortionist if you're going to stick a dagger at somebody's stomach? But to us, the interesting thing is, and it's just typical of the way people look at the great holy works of art, that virtually nobody notices the hand with the dagger. They just blank it out because they don't expect it to be there. Other things in the Last Supper. Leonardo painted himself as St. Jude, the second disciple along from Jesus' left. And he has his back to Jesus. Another thing that's interesting is that there is a disciple standing next to Jesus doing that, the John gesture, the John the Baptist gesture, virtually in Jesus' face. Could this be a kind of remember John the Baptist? Who knows? But certainly in Leonardo's works, that always refers to John the Baptist, even if he's not physically present, and of course he isn't at the Last Supper. It's interesting too that the character who very, very likely is Mary Magdalene has a hand cutting across her throat, and the hand is St. Peter's. And it's interesting that, according to the forbidden books, the lost Gospels, some of which may have been circulating in Leonardo's time in the underground movements and the secret societies and so on, they make much of the fact that St. Peter and Mary Magdalene were literally at each other's throats, basically Peter hated her. He hated her power over Jesus, he hated the fact that she was Jesus' favourite and not him, which is interesting, and he threatened her. And in one of these books, Mary Magdalene says to Jesus that I am afraid of Peter because he threatens me and hates all my sex. And so here in the painting you have a clear, in this giant M shape which she forms part, and Peter is slightly also forming part of it. He is threatening her actually visibly, visually in this painting. The last thing that I would like to point out about it is that although this is this depicts the holy scene where Jesus instigates the sacrament, the wine representing his blood and the bread representing his body, and yet there is no great chalice in front of him. There's very little wine, in fact, on the whole table. Could Leonardo, who we know from our research, absolutely hated the Holy Family, Jesus and the Holy Family, could he be saying this man never shed his blood for you? Also, although there's a lot of bread on the table, very, very little of it is broken. Could he be saying that he never broke his body on the cross for you?
That is a very radical position. And I think really the only people who I know hold that kind of position are the Mandeans, who never were Christians, even though they may have adopted the euphemism of the Christians of St. John in order to please the Crusaders and other Christians. They were never Christians. But I think within the more Christianized varieties of the esoteric tradition, it's not so likely that they're going to come up and say that Jesus has usurped the messianic role of John. But probably what they would say would be there have been several messengers of light throughout history. There have been several messiahs, not just the only begotten Son. And one of them was John. And then Jesus was there in a different way. And that not so much perhaps Jesus himself, but his followers then eclipsed the importance of John and said he was a forerunner who wasn't worthy to loosen the shoes of the one who came thereafter and so forth, and made a minor figure out of him. And that is where perhaps the injustice and the wrongful position came in. But such people would then probably also say that there will be others. Maybe soon, maybe not soon, we don't know when, but that the coming of messianic messengers from above is an ongoing process in history. And that, of course, to the Orthodox mind, takes the glory away from Jesus, because he's supposed to be the only one. It's actually an application of the monotheistic principle: one God, one law, one way.
In the Da Vinci Code, the characters Robert Langdon, Sophie Nouveau, and Lee Teaving visit Temple Church in London. Located between Fleet Street and the River Thames, Temple Church is a 12th century structure which is still used today as a place of worship. It was built by the Knights Templar on a site in London originally established for their order as a place of assembly by their first Grand Master, Hugh de Pau. The church consists of two separate sections. The building is formed by an area known as the Round Church and the adjoining rectangular section known as the Chancel. The Round Church is based on the design of Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in keeping with the Knights Templar traditions. The Round Church was consecrated in 1185 on February 10th by Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. It is also speculated that Henry II, the King of England, was present at the ceremony. It is in this round part of the church that some of the most interesting figures of the building are found. As stated in the Da Vinci Code, the church is known for the marble effigies of 9 knights arranged on the central floor. The characters in the novel have come to look for a knight a pope interred, a clue which they hope will lead them to the location of the Holy Grail. The Knights Templar are mentioned throughout the Da Vinci Code in association with either the Holy Grail or their possible discovery of the so-called treasure of Temple of Jerusalem. The religious military order was formed in 1118 when a knight of Champagne, Hugh de Bayonne, and his 8 crusading companions, bound to a vow taken before King Baldwin of Jerusalem to protect pilgrims traveling in the Holy Land. They specifically asked to be headquartered on the Temple Mount, which they renamed the Templum Domini. They wound up spending more time excavating beneath the temple than they did escorting pilgrims. The church rewarded their battle service by excusing normal ecclesiastical taxes, which allowed the Templars to expand their membership and become fantastically wealthy and powerful. Besides enormous land holdings and a vast navy, they were Europe's first international bankers. The order also gained a reputation for being obsessed with secret rituals, which allowed their enemies to trump up heretical charges when a move was finally made against them by France's King Philip IV, who envied their wealth and feared their military power. The king was supported in this effort by Pope Clement V, who had been convinced that the Templars were bent on the destruction of the church. On Friday, October 13, 1307, a substantial number of the Knights Templar in France were arrested. It is thought that the acts that followed those arrests, including confessions forced via torture, rigged trials, and executions, led to the popular conviction that Friday the 13th is unlucky, a superstition many people still maintain. Despite these official efforts to wipe out the order and its official dissolution by the Pope, it is thought that surviving members of the order escaped by sea with much of their fabled treasure, including early church artifacts, and traveled to Scotland. Moving now into the Chancellor's Temple Church, this is part of the building which replaced the earlier choir and was constructed when King Henry III expressed the wish to be buried there. Despite his admiration for the temple, however, it was discovered after his death that his will had been altered, which explains his burial in Westminster Abbey. Temple Church had seen many historic episodes unfold within its walls, from the negotiations that led to the Magna Carta, the abolition of the Knights Templar, and a refurbishment of Christopher Wren to a German bombing raid in 1941, which set the roof on fire, necessitating extensive restoration, which was completed in 1954. It is the tomb of Sir Isaac Newton that Robert Langdon and Sophie Neveu are drawn to. There they find the final clue that leads them to a showdown with Lee Teaving.
In Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, Robert Langdon and Sophie Neveu come to Roslin Chapel looking for the Holy Grail and to try and discover the secrets behind it. Roslin had actually been associated with the Holy Grail for a long time, not necessarily as a bloodline of Christ, but as a place where the physical cup of Christ, is thought to have been brought and hidden. There are many connections between Roslin and the Grail.
Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, is a city with a long history and many legends of its own. It is a few miles south of here that Robert Langdon and Sophie Neveu traveled to Roslin towards the end of their quest to solve the riddles designed by her murdered grandfather. Roslin Chapel, founded in 1446 by Earl William Sinclair, is now protected by a steel structure which provides a platform for viewing the church. It remains unfinished, however. Upon the death of its founder in 1484, his son Oliver added the roof but did not fully complete his father's vision.
If you wander into Roslin Glen, you can look up at the ruins of the castle. This is a haunted place where knights had ridden by in full suits of armour, while damsels cast their admiring glances down from the battlements. And it still is a magical place. If you walk round the inside of Roslin Chapel, you'll find that there are knights there riding on horses. There are unicorns and camels. There are over 150 green men in Roslin, If you actually follow them around, you see young children as green men, through to huge foliate heads to skulls. You actually have dead green men in Roslin. And these symbols have been around for hundreds of years. They're thought to be pagan survivals that have been brought into Christianity. But they symbolise more than anything else the life in nature, the seasons of a person's life as well. And at Roslin you have a sense in the chapel of it being alive. Every inch of the chapel is covered in leaves and flowers, so you can actually imagine that you've walked from the glen, from its trees, into the chapel, and it was known as the chapel amid the woods for many hundreds of years. So it feels a lot more alive than most places of worship.
Inside the chapel, the stonework is remarkable for its variety of animals, plants, angels and demons, all carved with enormous care and skill. Every surface is richly decorated, including the barrel-vaulted ceiling 40 feet above visitors' heads. The panels are carved with roses, lilies, and 5-pointed stars. Roslin Chapel fell into disuse after the Reformation, and in 1592 the altars were destroyed in order to avoid a threatened excommunication. In 1862, however, the church was rededicated following restoration. Now, thanks to ongoing preservation, we are able to appreciate the quality of work represented here. Prince Henry Sinclair, grandfather of the founder William, is said to have visited North America on a voyage in 1398, about 100 years before Columbus' presumed discovery. Among the rich selections of carvings in the chapel is maize, a plant common in the New World but unknown in Europe at that time.
Over the decade after that, there has been over a dozen books looking at Roslin and have coming up with all sorts of strange, mysterious kind of theories as to why the chapel was constructed in the first place, what the carvings within it mean, and what might be hidden beneath Roslin.
A macabre story is linked to a particular highly decorated pillar, known as the Apprentice Pillar. According to legend, while the master mason was traveling to Rome for instruction on how to complete the work, a young apprentice created this amazing piece of carved stone. Upon his return, the jealous master is said to have murdered the apprentice. From its foundation, Roslin and its evocative beauty have compelled visitors to speculate on the meaning of what they see around them and to contemplate on both our heavenly and earthly faiths.
This was the end of the medieval age, just at the beginning of the Renaissance. And what we actually have at Roslin is the peak of the medieval age. We have all of the symbolism, all of the characters. It's almost like a condensed version of the Middle Ages.
Enthusiasts and scholars have long sought to decipher some meaning from the hundreds of carved cubes lining the ceiling arches. There is even a prize for the first person to unravel the mystery.
There certainly are hundreds upon hundreds of cubes in the arches at the far end. Each one of these cubes on each of its surfaces has a different design carved into it. And there are a lot of different theories as to what these actually might be. Some people think that if you could actually decode these symbols on these cubes, you'd almost have a map and you could actually find a place, and that's where the treasure is. Some people think that it's music. There are different medieval instrument being held by angels at the end of a lot of these arches. So maybe this is a score to some medieval song. And if you played this song, then miraculously the vaults would open up and the treasure would be brought out. Nobody knows, and it's highly unlikely that anyone will ever work it out.
As Mark Oxbrow discussed, the chapel is linked in popular myth with the Order of the Knights Templar, and mystery surrounds the possible contents of the vaults or other chambers beneath the structure.
In the last few years, authors have speculated that the Roslin treasure may be the Ark of the Covenant. It may be other pieces of the treasure from Jerusalem. It may be the Knights Templar treasure, which was taken from France, allegedly, on boats from La Rochelle. It may be the embalmed head of Jesus. It's also been speculated that there are papyruses, or there are parchments which actually have the lost Gospels of Jesus Christ. There's an A to Z of theories as to what the treasure of Roslin is.
Possible items among this rumored hidden treasure are the Ark of the Covenant, the Stone of Destiny, and the Head of Christ, or Templar wreath preserved for the clutches of French King Philip IV.
Dan Brown tells us that Roslin Chapel was built by the Knights Templar. He tells us that there is a six-pointed star, the Star of David or Solomon's seal, trodden into the floor, worn down over ages. Neither of these are facts. There is no star worn down into the floor. There's actually, I don't think there's any six-pointed stars in any part of Roslin. There are an awful lot of five-pointed stars. The pentacle is an ongoing symbol throughout the whole chapel. But also the connections with the Knights Templar are entirely false.
There was obviously a presence of Knights Templar around the Roslin area. Although, as Mark Oxbrow states, it seems that the Knights Templar had nothing directly to do with the building of Roslin Chapel. This is still in contention by many researchers and authors even today. Just down the road from Roslin is the village of Ballintroduch, as it was called, today known as Temple, and it is here that the local Knights Templar had a headquarters and base. Indeed, legend states that the Knights Templar may well have actually taken part in the Battle of Bannockburn, arriving on the side of the Scots and possibly turning the tide of war. Though again, researchers and authors dispute these claims. Whatever, the Knights Templar appear to play an important role and a major part in the story of the area of Roslin and Roslin Chapel.
Well, first of all, we can assume, I think, quite with a good deal of probability, that quite a few people at that time who went to the Holy Land were already, at least to some degree, dissatisfied with the existing Orthodox paradigm of the Christian religion. In fact, some of them probably went on the crusade precisely because they wanted to discover something other. They went there because they felt, well, maybe if we go to the geographical location where all of this really happened, maybe we will discover the true Christianity. It was not, Christianity was not a very exciting religion in the Middle Ages. And so I think quite a few people who went there were ready for an alternative view. And it would seem that probably some of the Templars did receive a transmission of that sort.
In 1309, the Knights Templar were brought to trial at Holyrood in Edinburgh. And among dozens of locals from the Lothians and across southern Scotland, they testified that the Templars were bad Christians, that they didn't give money to the poor, that they would do anything to get extra land for the order, and that if the Templars had been good Christians, then they would have never lost the Holy Land.
When the accusations then subsequently in the 1300s were made against the Templars that they had secretly practiced certain heresies, among some of these accusations we definitely find elements that could very well have been derived from Mandean or related sources. So I think it's very, very likely that the Templars absorbed certain teachings and perhaps certain ceremonial practices from the Mandeans, which they brought back to Europe, and which they kept within an inner circle, obviously, because it was dangerous to do otherwise, and eventually they were found out, and when there were additional reasons why the King of France and the Pope wanted to do away with the Templars, then these were used as an excuse. See, they're heretics as well.
In the novel, Brown makes much of this secret organisation, casting them in a benevolent and friendly light. But do they really exist? The jury is still out on that one. Many researchers have written many, many hundreds of thousands of words on this shady organisation. But there's nothing concrete. There's no real evidence that any of those people, supposedly Grand Masters of Priory of Sion, people like Victor Hugo, Leonardo da Vinci himself, Jean Cocteau, there's no evidence whatsoever that relates them to this organisation. So Isaac Newton was supposed to have been a head, a Grand Master. But again, we have no evidence whatsoever. It seems more likely that the Priory of Sion as we know it today, this modern shady organisation, was real, but had an invented past.
This secret society, which certainly exists, he didn't make it up.
Sinclair as a name does appear in the Priory of Sion documents, but these documents were only written in the 20th century, and this is a fictional list of people. Clearly there's a lot of real names on that list of Grand Masters, but the Sinclairs that they talk about, Marie and so on, and Catherine, these people do not exist. There is absolutely nothing about these people in the historical record. So they've made them up.
From everything that I consider to be reputable material, the very name of the Prieuré de Sion was only invented by Plantard and his handful of followers in the 1950s. They didn't even use that term earlier, and I think it's a recent invention which tries to legitimize itself by making claims of being joined to other things in the past and being really a link in a chain of transmission, which it obviously is not.
The Priory of Sion mystery is inextricably linked up with another mystery, another great French mystery, which is that of the village of Rennes-le-Château. And most people get to know about the Priory of Sion because of this mystery, the mystery of this village in the south of France. Where did the priest get his money from?
What seems evident from the area of Rennes-le-Château, and the Languedoc in general, is that much was going on here. We have the Cathar heresy, the Cathars believing in a type of Gnostic goal, inner self, inner truth. We also have the Knights Templar ending up in this region building many castles and fortifications. We have the many churches dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist. And it seems that this area may hold a memory, an echo, of something far earlier, something much more important. And it's to this area that we must look, I think, for much more of an answer behind some of these conundrums.
The origin of the story underpinning the Da Vinci Code can be traced back to a small village in the south of France. The mystery of Rennes-le-Château has been outlined over the years in hundreds of books. It's a story of intrigue, politics, power, and a tantalizing lost secret. But above all, it's a story of fabled hidden treasure. There has been a settlement in the area of Rennes-le-Château for thousands of years. The Visigoths established a prosperous kingdom in the 5th century, extending into modern Spain until the Franks, led by Clovis, defeated them. Importantly, according to the secret history maintained by the Priory of Sion, The descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, living in southern France, had intermarried around this time with Franks descended from Jews who migrated to the area from Germany and before that Greece. This union was the basis of the Moravian royal lineage. Its emblems were the fish, a symbol of Jesus, the Lion of Judah, and the fleur-de-lis, later a symbol of French royalty. The last Moravian king was deposed in 750, but powerful descendants participated in the First Crusade in order to recover family histories from the Holy Land. They also created the Priory of Sion and its front organization, the Knights Templar.
The Priory of Zion have, to an extent, well, Lynn and I think have actually hijacked that genuine mystery because they claim, the dossier secret claimed that the Priory of Zion know all the answers to the Wren mystery, that they were behind it, that it was them that gave Saunier his money. And for that reason, a lot of the literature on the Rennes-le-Château mystery has involved the Priory of Zion.
Centuries later, in 1781, parish priest Antoine Bigot was appointed the guardian of the church at Rennes-le-Château. He was also entrusted with a great secret by Marie Blanchefort, surviving member of a local noble family which went back many generations. It's said that he hid the documents in a Visigoth pillar, which supported the church altar, and also created 2 additional monuments with cryptic writing on them. In the late 1800s, the church at Rennes-le-Château attained its greatest notoriety when parish priest François Bérenger Sanguier discovered hidden documents within. He took the material to church authorities and suddenly became a wealthy and important man.
We think that although the mystery itself is genuine, there's a real question about where he got his money from and what kind of things Saunier was up to. He seemed to have been involved in some very unorthodox activities. But the Priory of Zion seemed to have rather, say hijacked that. They found this mystery, which wasn't terribly well known when they first started to bring it into the dossier secret in the early 60s. And by linking themselves so closely with it, it's almost all the literature that's come after, all the researchers are always trying to work out, you can't write about the Rennes-le-Château mystery without also writing about the Priory of Zion. And they may actually be nothing whatever to do with each other. There's hijacking of one mystery by another.
The information that was fed to the authors, the 3 authors, I think, was largely sort of the matrix of French esotericism, but doctored and slanted by Pierre Plantard in the direction of the Priory de Sion hypothesis. So I think that is really where a lot of the material really goes awry.
It is believed that his discovery was possibly buried treasure from Jerusalem, or the wealth of long-dead Moravian king Dagobert. It may also have been material linking the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene to the area's Moravian royalty and their living heirs, the very stuff that caused the 20-year crusade against the Cathars and may have played a role in the subsequent repression of the Knights Templar. Father Saunier used his new wealth to restore the church at Rennes-le-Château, and unbeknownst to him, his name was happily used by author Dan Brown for his character Jacques Saunier, the Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, whose early murder sets the Da Vinci Code in glorious motion.
And there's lots of interesting questions come out of that. But did the people behind the dossier secret, let's call them the Priory of Zion, totally hijack something, or did they do they know something about the mystery? Were they involved in it, but they've added their own bits to lead people in the directions that they want to go? I think the only thing we can be really sure about is that their version of what really happened back, at the turn of the 20th century with Saunier and his money, their version doesn't stand up. There are anomalies and errors in it that you can actually prove it.
Well, certainly there is, let's say, there is an underlying modicum of truth in all of them. But that truth is considerably obscured by, I think, a great deal of speculative and invented material. And it takes, I think, a person of a certain deeper intuitive perception to sort out this wheat from the chaff.
The work on the church progressed. The flagstone was broken, and reportedly a treasure was found inside, possibly hidden for local nobles during the French Revolution. There was also a manuscript which was decoded and makes reference to Saint Sulpice and the artist Teniers, which was an anagram of the epitaph on the Marquis de Blancheford's tombstone. During further renovation, the altar was removed and hidden documents discovered. It needed to be translated by specialists, and after consulting the Bishop of Carcassonne, Saunier visited Paris and the church of Saint-Sulpice. Saint-Sulpice is the famous Parisian church where the Da Vinci Code's fearsome enforcer Silas is directed to look for a keystone at the bottom of the obelisk. The church of Saint-Sulpice was originally built in the Moravian era within the boundaries of the Abbey of Saint-Mond-du-Pré as a parish church for the peasants living within its jurisdiction on the left bank of Paris. The church is dedicated to Saint-Sulpice, the 6th century Archbishop of Bourg, whose feast day is January the 17th. Priory of Sion documents known as the Dossier Secrets claimed that the church was actually built on the remains of an earlier pagan temple of Isis, and that a statue of Isis was said to have been worshipped as the Virgin Mary at Saint-Germain until it was destroyed in 1514. The parish of Saint-Germain grew in importance due to the abbey's own church of Saint-Mond-du-Pré, which housed the piece of the True Cross and the tunic of Saint Vincent. Saint-Sulpice itself was continually rebuilt and enlarged to serve a growing local population, which was also becoming wealthier. Work on the current building intended to serve the seminary of Saint-Sulpice and to rival Notre Dame of Paris in both size and importance. It began in 1646, but it immediately ran into financial difficulties. 6 architects struggled to complete it over a period of 134 years. The church contains works of many fine artists. The Chapel of the Holy Angels was decorated by Eugene Delacroix, who spent several years between 1855 and 1861 working on the commission.
It was to the church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris that Berenger Saunier turned to try and get the legendary parchments that he supposedly found in his church deciphered. There is an interesting fact about Saint-Sulpice. Within the church is a gnomon. This gnomon, or obelisk-like instrument, stands against one of the walls in the church, and on certain days of the year the sun shines through an opposite window, illuminating certain parts of the gnomon. Beneath the gnomon and stretching out in a long brass line along the church floor is something known as the rose line.
The gnomon, or sundial in the church of Saint-Sulpice, almost exactly at the base of the obelisk that forms part of it, is hiding place of the keystone that Silas is seeking. He smashes a floor tile over a hollow spot, only to discover a biblical quote from Job rather than the map he sought. It was the pastor of Saint-Sulpice, Jean-Baptiste Londejague, who was responsible for raising funds to build the Gnomon in 1737. The pastor wanted to establish the exact times of the equinoxes so that he could calculate the date on which Easter would fall each year. The Gnomon consists of a brass line that runs north-south set into the floor of the transept of the church. A white marble obelisk with a brass line continuing up the center bears the sign of Capricorn. The sun strikes it at the winter solstice on December the 21st. The obelisk bears a royal inscription at its base commemorating the purpose of the sundial's construction. Since the inscription contained the names of the king and his ministers, it was defaced during the French Revolution, an event which also saw their trials and executions. In the chapel of St. John the Baptist, the sculptor Louis Samon Vassal has portrayed the saint with his forefinger raised in what is known as the John gesture.
That's really something that Dan Brown doesn't pick up on in his book. Not something that he built into his fictional scenario. He goes down the line of the great secret that's being sought and being protected is the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that they had children who settled in France, and a secret society called the Priory of Zion has existed throughout the ages to protect the descendants of that bloodline for whatever reason.
When it jumps over into the Prieuré de Sion and the whole children of Mary Magdalene matrix and so forth, then it's in an entirely different realm again.
I look at the Magdalene as Jesus' true successor, which sounds mad. Everybody says, no, it's St. Peter. No, according to the Gnostic Gospels, it was her. And also, there is a big question mark over her ethnicity. I've traced her possible roots. Nobody can be certain at this space in time. But I've traced her possible roots to either Egypt or Ethiopia, in which case she was very likely a black woman.
Close to the village of Rennes-le-Château is the small seaside town of Saint-Marie-sur-Mer. Saint-Marie-sur-Mer celebrates the name Mary Magdalene. But also at Saint-Marie-sur-Mer, in one of the churches there, in the little crypt, is a Black Madonna. But this Black Madonna is not of Mary Magdalene or Mary Mother of God. This unique Black Madonna is a Black Madonna celebrating the life of Sansara. Sansara is not actually recognised by the Catholic Church as a saint, but the local gypsies of the Camargue region, once a year in May, celebrate the life and times of this unknown saint. Sansara, so legend will have us tell, came ashore in a boat with Mary Magdalene and various other characters, fleeing the Holy Land after the death of Christ. Sansara, according to legend, was either the handmaiden of Mary Magdalene, or according to some, quite possibly the offspring of Mary Magdalene, and possibly the offspring of Mary Magdalene and a union with her and the Christ figure. This Black Madonna is paraded once a year through the streets of Saint-Marie-sur-Mer, taken to the ocean, bathed in the Mediterranean, and paraded back to the church.
Mary Magdalene was also a very important figure in that alternative form of Christianity. Whether a really specific and separate tradition ever descended from her as such, for this we really have no evidence. But certainly I think along with Thomas and probably Philip and Matthias, she stands as one of the principal figures of the alternative or Gnostic form of Christianity in earlier apostolic times.
And my research has indicated that, in fact, she was very much Jesus' other half. But you wouldn't know this, of course, from the New Testament. But of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John aren't the only Gospels in existence. Although ask virtually any Christian now and they will say, well, of course they are. You know, they are the only Gospels. They are the Gospels. But there are, we know, at least 6 other Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, the forbidden books, if you like. When the Church was put into its present form, when the New Testament was put into its present form in the 4th century AD, a lot of books that were around that just as much claimed to be considered authentic as Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were basically voted out of what became the New Testament, and Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were put in. These other books were instantly overnight forbidden, and anybody who had one or knew of one was on notice that basically you got rid of them or you yourself would end up on the flaming pyre.
The public, shall we say, for a very long time has been misled, primarily by the Christian Church, into believing that from the very beginning, from the time of Jesus and Peter and so forth, there was one unified Christian community or church. And increasingly over the last couple of 100 years, or even maybe even more, it has become evident that was not the case. That there were sort of independent and semi-independent Christian communities of various orientations spread all over as Christianity grew in the Middle East, and they all had a reverence for Jesus and his message in common, but that there was no uniformity among them. They were for the most part in friendly relations with each other, but they were not a unified organization. That's not the way that sort of thing worked at that time. And then, beginning in the 3rd century, there came more and more people who wanted to impose their particular orthodox vision on the rest. So it was a gradual takeover by a particular party, beginning at the in the beginning in the 3rd century and then continuing thereafter.
The more important secret is to do with these heretical ideas concerning John the Baptist. And it's actually something that may have actually confused readers of the Da Vinci Code, that one of our decodings of Leonardo's paintings, which is the Virgin of the Rocks, the version that's in the Louvre in Paris, where we've decoded it into a very definite Johannite interpretation. Johannite being this heresy which is centred on John the Baptist, and him actually being superior, regarded as superior even to Jesus. In some ways he's regarded as the true Christ.
Other than the Mandeans, it's really hard to tell how much, what component of the alternative tradition is John the Baptist tradition, but there is certainly probably some of it in there.
It was during the same visit that Saunier supposedly acquired the reproductions of 2 paintings. The first, Burghers of Arctie, by Nicolas Poussin, is thought to portray a tomb in the countryside near Rennes-le-Château. The second is David Teniers, the Youngers, The Temptation of Anthony, whose feast day of January 17th seems to play an important and recurrent role in the story. Whatever secret artifacts and knowledge the Templars brought back from Jerusalem were hidden in the area of Rennes-le-Château and fortified the beliefs of the local Christian sect, the Cathars, who were eventually destroyed by papal and French-backed crusade against their supposed heresy. Of note, this is the only crusade the Knights Templar refused to support.
When you look at alternative history books on things like the Knights Templar, the Holy Grail, or Rennes-le-Château, you find that secondary sourcing is really the name of the game. A lot of these researchers simply quote one another. They quote from one another's books, from one another's research, and the whole thing goes round in circles.
One of the important issues which I think is not sufficiently considered by the writers in the popular vein at the present time, in wake of Da Vinci Code and things of that sort, is that in order to hold certain positions in spiritual matters, one needs not necessarily to have received such teachings from somebody else who received them from somebody else who received them from somebody else. In other words, a horizontal historical transmission is not the only way to reach certain spiritual positions. There is a vertical position in addition to that. They may have received it as the result of their own inspiration. So it's almost like there are two dimensions. There is a horizontal dimension of history with its transmissions and traditions and various convolutions, and then there is a vertical dimension which intersects that at any time, where people have their own inspiration. And therefore, not if there are similarities between positions, that does not indicate necessarily a historical connection. It may mean a similar inspiration as well. But since our culture is so secular and so materialistic, even about spiritual things, it doesn't really consider the vertical dimension. It's always looking for a horizontal dimension. And it's a mistake. They are both there. They are like a cross when they come together. So, let's see, if Leonardo had some, if Leonardo indeed had some Johannine predilections and things of that sort, he could have come by these in a number of ways. Some of which could have been purely inspirational, some of it could have come from Hermetic and Kabbalistic literature and things of that sort, and any number of sources.
These ideas about the origins of Christianity, the suppression of the feminine, the idea that the church has been engaged in cover-up of information that they've always known to be true. It's brought those ideas to a whole new audience, and which is a good thing. But naturally, it's attracted a lot of criticism, a lot of hostility from from orthodoxy, from those who defend the conventional teachings of Christianity.
Are these two approaches or ideas, alternative Christianity, possibly going back to John the Baptizer, at least to some degree, and the rediscovery of the feminine, are they possibly related to each other? And if you ask me that question, I would say most definitely so. Because there is plenty of evidence, implicit and explicit, indicating that the alternative Christianity contained a very powerful emphasis on the feminine. But of course not exclusively the feminine. If we are looking for the New Age, the goddess, which is basically just a rebaptized Jehovah, is a Miss Jehovah, then we are not going to find that there. But we are going to find the feminine both at the metaphysical level, going clear up to the divine, and right down at the practical level, being held in much higher regard and in a position of equality, and so forth. And this was present you can see it historically present in the alternative tradition. I mean, look at the 12th and 13th century, the Cathars had women and men in totally equal position among their perfecti. It was something that was totally unknown in Europe anywhere at that time. Earlier on, the Manichaeans had women perfecti as well, which not as prominently as the Cathars perhaps, but they were still there. So it was always there. And even when we see attacks of Irenaeus and these various heresiologists, church fathers against the Gnostics, one of the big accusations is that they have women teachers and they have women leaders, women prophetesses, and women are served communion and women even baptized. Oh my God, you know. So you can see at a very basic level that the alternative tradition had always a much greater respect for the feminine. And so when the alternative tradition was repressed, the feminine was also repressed. The two went together. Now when the alternative tradition is emerging again, the feminine is also re-emerging. So there is a very close connection between the two.
We think it's very interesting that the ones that have come to light that have been translated into English, certainly, tell a very different story from the New Testament about Jesus and his relationship with Mary Magdalene. In the New Testament, she's hardly mentioned by name. You think, well, why should somebody like Leonardo da Vinci and all sorts of other people have this thing about her, believe that she was so important? And of course, there's no real reason for the New Testament. But if you look at some of these other books, for example, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you might begin to understand. She is described as being Jesus' apostle of the apostles. And certainly the first heretics, quote heretics, the believers in these books, described her like that. She wasn't just the first century equivalent of a woman tagging along making the coffee for the men. She was very important, she was rich, she was independent. She had no concept of being a little woman. She was feisty, she was outspoken. She actually, according to one of these forbidden books, got Jesus to change his teaching on a quite central matter, which is quite astonishing. She also severely put the noses out of joint of the male disciples, especially St. Peter, who hated her. And he said in one of these books to Jesus, "Lord, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Which is very interesting because this personal spat between Mary, who was Jesus' second right-hand man, if you like, in quotes, and St. Peter, seemed to prefigure what happened to their movements. You know, hers became a sort of goddess-worshipping, intuitive, Gnostic, fluid movement, not a church with a capital C. And of course he founded the misogynist Church of Rome. So it was prefigured by their personal relationship, which is to me particularly interesting. But also in these forbidden books and Gnostic Gospels, Jesus is, the disciples go to Jesus and say, "Lord, why do you prefer her to us? Why are you always kissing her on the mouth?" And you think, why do you think? You know, but it's spelt out there. They had a relationship. They weren't necessarily married, and I don't believe they were. But certainly they had an intimate relationship. No wonder these books are not in the New Testament, but I think that everybody should know about them. And the Da Vinci Code helps people understand that there's more out there. There's hidden stuff.
The thinking behind this seems to be that all these books that are offering an alternative version of the origins of Christianity and the Christian story and the way the Christian church developed, if we can debunk all of these alternatives, they seem to think, then what's left is the conventional teaching.
So what is the Da Vinci Code? Well, on one level it's simply a novel. Robert Langdon comes along, solves the puzzle, gets the girl, saves the world. Easy. But on the other level, it's something deeper, much, much deeper. And Dan Brown has opened a seam of research and of thought that needed opening for a long time.
There is every bit of likelihood, I think, that Jesus himself taught and practiced a whole number of doctrines and sacraments and things of that sort, which were not allowed to become part of Orthodox or mainstream Christianity. So they just took a part. The other part was left to the side. For which reason Orthodox Christianity was lacking in wholeness for 2,000 years.
I simply wrote a story that explores how and why this shift might have occurred, what it says about our past, and more importantly, what it says about our future.